In 1925, a Norfolk, Virginia housewife named Mrs. Robert Davis sat down and mailed a cake recipe to a pineapple company. She had no idea she was one of over 60,000 people doing the exact same thing that year, all chasing a spot in a cookbook nobody remembers today. She won. But so, in a sense, did about 2,500 other strangers who had mailed in almost the identical recipe without ever speaking to one another. That sounds like an odd way to build an American classic, but the story of the pineapple upside-down cake didn't start in a kitchen at all. It started with a stolen kingdom, a Harvard dropout's failed vegetable farm, and a machine that could gut 100 pineapples a minute. So how did a niche tropical fruit, once too expensive for anyone but the rich, end up baked into the single most recognizable dessert of the American 1950s? Before any of this touches Hawaii or pineapple or Dole, it starts with a much older problem. How do you bake anything at all if you don't own an oven? For centuries, home cooks across Europe and colonial America worked over an open hearth, using heavy cast iron or copper skillets set directly on or beside the fire. Heat came from below, not from all around, which meant a cake batter poured straight into a hot pan would scorch on the bottom long before it ever finished setting on top. So cooks improvised. They lined the bottom of the pan with butter, sugar, and whatever fruit was in season, then poured the batter over that. The fruit caramelized against the hot metal while the cake baked above it, and when it came off the heat, there was only one way to serve it: flip it. What had spent the whole cook sitting on the bottom of the pan became the top of the dessert the second it hit the plate. This wasn't a technique anyone invented so much as a technique nobody could avoid. It shows up in one form or another in regional European baking for centuries before the English phrase upside-down cake existed at all. The term itself barely appears in print before the mid-1800s. A version of it turns up in French pastry manuals from the early 1840s describing reversed cakes made with apples and other fruit. The workaround wasn't tied to any one country. It was tied to a shared limitation: no reliable oven, a fire that only heats from one direction, and fruit that would otherwise burn. That's the part of this story most people skip entirely because it isn't glamorous. There's no company, no contest, no photograph. Just a few centuries of ordinary cooks solving the same physical problem the same way, independently, on two different continents. It's the quiet ancestor sitting underneath every version of this dessert that came later, including the one that's about to make an entire American company very, very rich. If you like this kind of deep dive into where your favorite foods actually come from, hit subscribe now. We've got a whole series on the hidden histories hiding in your kitchen. Before this story becomes a story about cake, it's a story about a fruit that almost nobody in America had ever tasted fresh. Pineapple had grown in Hawaii since at least the early 1800s, and small canning operations existed on the islands by the 1880s. But none of them operated at any meaningful scale, and here's why. Pineapple is a brutal fruit to transport. Pick it green so it survives the trip and it never ripens. Let it ripen on the plant and it rots before the ship carrying it reaches San Francisco. That single logistics problem kept pineapple a luxury item, something a wealthy household in Boston or New York served to show off, not something anyone's grandmother kept in the pantry. It was, quite literally, worth its weight in gold to the people who could get it. That was the world a 22-year-old Harvard graduate named James Drummond Dole walked into in 1899 when he arrived in the Hawaiian territory with $1,500 and a horticulture degree. He bought 64 acres of government homestead land north of Honolulu, and he had one idea nobody in the local business community thought would work. Can the pineapple on the island ripe and ship it out already sealed. The Honolulu Advertiser mocked him for it in print, calling his new company a foolhardy venture which had been tried unsuccessfully before and was sure to fail again. Local investors wouldn't touch it. Dole had to sail back to Boston, hat in hand, and scrape together $14,000 from family and friends just to keep the cannery running. It was a business built on a fruit almost nobody thought could survive a boat ride. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Dole's cannery survived its first shaky years, but the moment that actually changed everything wasn't financial. It was mechanical. In 1913, an engineer named Henry Ginaka built a machine for Dole's factory that could peel, core, and slice a pineapple automatically, a job that had taken a skilled worker with a knife roughly a minute per fruit, now done by a machine capable of tearing through about 100 pineapples every 60 seconds. The numbers that followed are almost hard to believe. Hawaii's total canned pineapple output went from around 243,000 cases in 1909 to 1,775,000 cases by 1920. That's a 630% increase in 11 years. By 1923, the Hawaiian Pineapple Company was the largest producer of its kind on the planet. Dole understood, better than almost anyone in his industry, that a can of fruit needed a story attached to it to actually sell. In 1927, 4 days after Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight made headlines around the world, Dole personally put up $25,000 in prize money for the first pilot to fly non-stop from the American mainland to Honolulu, a stunt now remembered as the Dole Air Race. It had nothing directly to do with pineapple. It had everything to do with keeping the Dole name in every newspaper in the country. By then, Dole's company was just one piece of a much larger machine. Hawaii's plantation economy, sugar and pineapple both, was effectively run by 5 interlocking corporations: Alexander and Baldwin, American Factors, Castle and Cook, C. Brewer, and Theo. Davies. Historians simply call them the Big Five. Through overlapping ownership, intermarriage, and shared boards of directors, these 5 companies controlled not just the plantations, but the banks, the shipping lines, and the insurance companies the plantations depended on, meaning there was effectively no path to economic power on the islands that didn't run through one of them. But there's a question sitting underneath all of that growth that most retellings skip right past. Whose land was this actually happening on, and whose hands were running that machine? Rewind 6 years before Dole ever set foot in Hawaii. In 1893, a group of American businessmen, backed by US Marines, helped overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and the sovereign Hawaiian kingdom. 5 years later, in 1898, the United States formally annexed the islands as a territory. That annexation is the reason Dole could even buy that 64-acre homestead in 1900. It was land made available specifically to attract American settlers to a territory that, a decade earlier, had belonged to someone else entirely. In the years that followed, land that native Hawaiians had farmed and lived on for generations was rapidly converted into commercial sugar and pineapple plantations, controlled by a small handful of interlocking companies that would eventually become known, bluntly, as the Big Five. Traditional land use, built around shared access and subsistence farming, was replaced almost overnight with a plantation economy designed to grow one crop for one export market at the largest scale possible. The plantations needed labor to run at that scale, and they got it by importing workers from around the world under contract: Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Portuguese, and Korean laborers, brought in wave after wave, decade after decade. And the system that received them was deliberately built to keep them from ever standing on equal footing with each other. White supervisors and owners lived in the best housing on the plantation. immigrant laborers were placed in overcrowded, low-quality quarters, sorted by ethnicity, paid according to a strict racial hierarchy that had nothing to do with the actual work being done. Historians who've studied the plantation records are blunt about why. Keeping the workforce divided along ethnic lines was not an accident. It was the entire management strategy. It built fortunes for 5 companies and the families who controlled them. It stripped an indigenous population of sovereignty over their own islands. It created, from scratch, one of the most rigid racial labor hierarchies in American agricultural history. And it did all 3 of those things at the exact same time, on the same land, to produce the same can of fruit sitting quietly on a shelf. By 1909, thousands of Japanese sugar plantation workers had had enough. They organized a strike demanding a wage increase to 25 cents a day. 25 cents. That was the ask. The plantation owners refused. In the years after that strike was broken, the plantations didn't raise wages. They did something colder. They imported large numbers of Filipino laborers specifically to flood the labor market, creating a surplus of desperate workers that would keep everyone's wages pinned down through competition instead of collective bargaining. A government immigration report from that period noted, almost approvingly, that plantation owners would like to bring into the islands large numbers of Filipinos or other cheap labor to create a surplus. This pattern repeated for decades. Workers were paid partly in company scrip, redeemable only at company stores, and housed on company land, in company-built camps often segregated by nationality: Japanese camp, Filipino camp, Portuguese camp, a physical layout that made cross-ethnic organizing logistically difficult even when workers wanted it. Housing, medical care, and schooling were provided not as rights, but as privileges the plantation could grant or withdraw depending on a worker's behavior and standing. When World War II arrived, Hawaii was placed under martial law, which froze wages territory-wide and made labor organizing itself a punishable offense. Union membership, which had already been fragile, collapsed to a few hundred people across the entire territory. By the time the war ended, 3 full generations had lived and died inside a system explicitly designed so that no single group of workers could ever gather enough leverage to change it. By the 1940s, the sugar and pineapple industry was generating a combined $160 million a year for its owners. The workers producing that fortune were earning, on average, about 24 cents an hour. It built fortunes, it ground down 3 generations of immigrant families. It quietly financed the very industrial expansion that would soon put pineapple on every table in America. This is the part most people never learn about when they bite into a slice of cake with a cherry sitting in the center. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. For decades, that system held, reinforced by geographic isolation and by a Republican political establishment on the islands that answered directly to the plantation owners. But once wartime martial law lifted, it finally broke. A labor organizer named Jack Hall, who had arrived in the islands in the 1930s and became the ILWU's first regional director in 1944, spent years building something the plantations had always managed to prevent before: a single union that crossed every ethnic line at once. In September of 1946, that work paid off. Roughly 26,000 sugar workers, representing 76,000 people once you count their families, walked off 33 of Hawaii's 34 sugar plantations at once. It was organized by the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, the ILWU, and it succeeded where 3 earlier generations of strikes had failed for one specific reason. This time, the union refused to let the plantations divide workers by ethnicity. Meetings were run in English, Japanese, and Ilocano at minimum, sometimes Visayan as well. Filipino and Japanese workers who had once been pitted against each other by management were now sitting on the same strike committees, translating for one another, holding the picket lines together. 99% of eligible workers voted to strike. Virtually nobody crossed the picket line. The strike lasted 79 days and shut the plantation economy down completely. When it ended, wages had climbed by roughly 20 to 40%. And for the first time, housing, medical care, and pensions became contractual rights instead of favors a plantation could grant or take away on a whim. A year later, in 1947, the same organizing energy spread to 20,000 pineapple workers and their families. And in 1949, Hawaii's longshoremen struck again, this time over the plain fact that they were paid less than mainland dock workers for identical work, a policy the union bluntly called the colonial wage theory. That strike lasted 157 days against enormous odds, including strike-breaking efforts backed by the territorial government itself. The union won anyway. It toppled a labor system that had stood essentially unchanged for 3 generations. It rewrote Hawaii's political map, ending 50 years of unbroken control by a single political establishment tied to the plantation owners. And it happened at the same moment the pineapple industry it targeted was already busy selling America a wholesome, sunny dessert built on the very system these workers were striking to dismantle. While that labor history was unfolding on the plantations, Dole had a much simpler problem back on the mainland. How do you get ordinary Americans to actually cook with all this pineapple you're now producing by the millions of cases? In 1925, the Hawaiian Pineapple Company launched a nationwide recipe contest, promoted heavily in women's magazines, judged by representatives from Fanny Farmer's cooking school, Good Housekeeping, and McCall's magazine. The prize was a spot in an upcoming cookbook of the 100 best pineapple recipes. More than 60,000 recipes came in. Out of those 60,000, roughly 2,500, nearly one submission in 25, was some version of a pineapple upside-down cake. That number is the whole story in miniature. Nobody invented this dessert in a single kitchen. It had already spread, quietly and independently, into households across the country, grafted onto a much older European technique, baking fruit and sugar on the bottom of a hot pan, then flipping the whole thing over once it came off the heat, a workaround that had existed in one form or another since cooks worked over open fires with no ovens at all. What canned pineapple did was give that old technique a new, glamorous ingredient. A perfectly uniform golden ring with a bright red maraschino cherry sitting in the center like a bullseye. It photographed well. It required no peeling, no coring, no waste. And thanks to Dole's marketing, it now cost pennies instead of a small fortune. The winning entry came from Mrs. Robert Davis of Norfolk, Virginia, published the following year. But with 2,500 nearly identical recipes flooding in from strangers who'd never met, nobody can honestly claim to be the sole inventor. Dole didn't need to invent the cake. The company just needed to be standing there, camera ready, the moment America invented it for them, and then take credit in every magazine ad for the next 30 years. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the cake kept spreading through regional cookbooks and magazine pages. The Farmer's Wife published its own version in October of 1926. Crescent baking powder, Spry vegetable shortening, and various pineapple growers associations all ran advertising built around the dessert, each one hitching its product to a cake that, by that point, was selling itself. By the 1950s, it had become something close to a national shorthand for hospitable American home entertaining. Betty Crocker's cookbooks featured multiple versions of it. Bisquick built entire ad campaigns promoting the cake as the easy, modern dessert for a housewife with less domestic help and less time than earlier generations. A can of pineapple, a box of pre-mixed baking flour, butter, brown sugar, a handful of maraschino cherries, about 15 minutes of prep before it ever touched the oven. It built a reputation for effortless American hospitality. It sat on dinner tables next to Jell-O molds and casseroles as a symbol of post-war convenience cooking. And it did all of that while the workers who had grown, picked, and canned the fruit inside it were, at that exact moment, in the middle of the two biggest labor strikes in Hawaiian history, fighting for the wages that had never once been raised to match the fortune their product was generating on the mainland. By the time the cake reached its peak, it wasn't just a recipe anymore. It was a fixture. It showed up at church potlucks, Sunday dinners, and diner dessert counters from coast to coast, usually served warm, usually served with the cherry still sitting dead center like a bullseye. Restaurant chains and roadside diners kept it on menus specifically because it required almost no specialized skill to plate attractively. The presentation was already built into the recipe. Flip the pan and the decoration was done for you. Home economics classes across the country taught it as a foundational skillet recipe well into the 1960s, which meant an entire generation of American schoolchildren learned to bake this specific dessert before they learned almost anything else in a kitchen. It became, in a very literal sense, one of the first cakes millions of Americans ever made with their own hands. That kind of cultural saturation doesn't happen to a dessert by accident. It happens when an ingredient becomes cheap enough for everyone at almost the exact same historical moment that a food industry is actively looking for something easy to advertise. Canned pineapple checked every box: uniform, shelf-stable, pre-sliced, endlessly photogenic in black and white magazine print. The cake didn't need to be reinvented every decade to stay relevant. It just needed the can to stay on the shelf and the shelf to stay affordable. Here's where the story arrives at the present, because the pattern it set never really stopped. James Dole himself didn't get to watch the empire he built simply keep growing forever. In 1932, his own company collapsed financially, brought down by years of overexpansion into land the market couldn't actually absorb. The Hawaiian Pineapple Company he had founded in 1901, scraped together with 14,000 borrowed dollars, essentially failed. A new company was organized to acquire what was left of it: the land, the canneries, the equipment, and crucially, the brand name that had taken 30 years to build. Dole himself was pushed out of day-to-day leadership, though he kept being paid for the use of his own name for the rest of his life. It's a strange kind of ending. The man who built the entire industry from a 64-acre homestead didn't get to run the company that carried his name into its most profitable decades. By the time he died in 1958, pineapple was contributing $116 million a year to the Hawaiian economy, and the islands were producing 72% of the entire world's supply. The Dole Food Company that carries his name today operates in more than 90 countries. But the geography of pineapple production has shifted dramatically since then. Hawaii, once responsible for nearly 3/4 of the global supply, now barely registers in the numbers. By 2023, global pineapple production had climbed to roughly 29.6 million metric tons a year, led not by Hawaii at all, but by Indonesia, the Philippines, Costa Rica, and Brazil, together accounting for more than a third of the world's total output. Production worldwide has grown more than fourfold since 1961. And the labor questions never actually disappeared. they just moved with the industry. As recently as 2021, former pineapple workers at a Maui farm received a $4.8 million settlement after federal investigators documented Thai laborers there being slapped, thrown against walls, and threatened with deportation between 2003 and 2007. 100 years separate the 1909 sugar strike and that settlement. The specific company changed. The specific country the workers came from changed. The basic shape of the story, cheap imported labor underneath a product marketed as wholesome and cheerful on the other end of the supply chain, did not. There's something almost uncomfortable sitting inside this dessert once you know where it came from. The pineapple upside-down cake exists because a stolen kingdom became a US territory, because a Harvard graduate nobody believed in built a machine that could process 100 pineapples a minute, and because a workforce kept deliberately divided by ethnicity spent half a century producing the fruit that made all of it profitable. It built fortunes for 5 interlocking companies. It displaced an indigenous nation from its own land and sovereignty. It fed millions of ordinary American households a cheap, cheerful 15-minute dessert for the better part of a century. All 3 of those things are true about the exact same object sitting in a 9-inch cake pan on a Sunday afternoon. That's how a surprising amount of food history actually works. The dishes that end up on your table rarely arrive because a single brilliant person designed them from nothing. They arrive because an industrial system, a colonial land grab, a mechanized cannery, a marketing department, a magazine recipe contest, found an old technique, attached a new ingredient to it, and sold it at scale to as many households as possible. Somewhere upstream of that sale, there is almost always a cost that never made it onto the label. In this case, that cost was paid, generation after generation, by workers half a world away from the kitchens where the finished cake actually got served, sliced, and eaten. None of this makes the cake itself sinister. Nobody flipping one out of a cast iron skillet on a Sunday afternoon is doing anything wrong. But the distance between a dessert and the history that produced it is exactly the point. Ordinary things, a can on a shelf, a recipe in a drawer, a cherry pressed into a ring of fruit, are almost never as simple as they look sitting on a kitchen counter. They're the visible tip of a much longer chain, a kingdom, a machine, a strike, a magazine ad. The cake just happens to be the part you can actually taste. So look around your kitchen right now. If there's a can of pineapple rings sitting in the pantry or a jar of maraschino cherries left over from some other recipe, you're looking at the last physical link in a chain that runs backward through a 1946 picket line, a 1925 magazine contest, a Janaka peeling machine tearing through 100 pineapples a minute, and a kingdom that stopped being a kingdom in 1893. Comment below and tell us, did you grow up eating pineapple upside-down cake, and did anyone in your family ever tell you where the pineapple in it actually came from? If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which part surprised you the most.